Yes. All right. I know we're in the week of midterm, so hopefully people will continue sort of trickling, but I know it's time to start. Good afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that as a land-grant institution, the Department of Architecture and Urban Design at UCLA recognizes our presence in the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of the Gabrielino Tongva peoples. It is a pleasure to welcome today Jeannette Kuo to AUD. Jeannette is a founding partner at Karamuk Kuo, together with her partner, Unal Karamuk, that I know is sitting over there, but I'm not gonna ask him to lecture too. They established the office in Zurich in 2010. With an ever-growing collection of projects in Europe, they continue to expand the office portfolio with projects in the US, including the expansion of the Rice School of Architecture that is currently under construction. Almost finished, right? I hope you showed that today. I saw it in foundation state. The office focuses on the relationship of space and program with projects of a range of scales, from installation and exhibitions to complex institutional projects. Each project is approached, and I quote, with the optimism that architecture is the translation of fresh ideas into reality. Okay, this mic is really giving me a lot of trouble. Both the office and their projects have been recognized with nominations and awards that include the Yakov Chernikov Prize, the Lafarge-Holcim Foundation Award, 2 Best Architects 19 awards for the Wyden Secondary School and Gym, and the International Sports Sciences Institute at the University of Lausanne. And the office was included in the 50 Best Architecture Firms of the 2020 Domus magazine. The office and a long list of project features have been included in publications such as A+U, A+T, Metropolis and Wallpaper magazines, the Architectural Review, Domus, Casabella, and our own Pool magazine, to name a few. Jeannette is also the editor of 2 books, the 2013 Atypical Plan and the 2015 Space of Production. In 2018, Karamuk Kuo was featured in the 196th issue of El Croquis. Jeannette started her teaching career in 2006 and has been committed to architecture education ever since. She has held positions at MIT, GST, EPFL in Lausanne, and she currently holds the Professor of Architecture and Construction at TU in Munich. I was thinking that we don't have a Professor of Architecture and Construction position here at AUD, and that we should have one, and that it would be fantastic for Jeannette to be the one doing it, although I would have to convince her to start traveling again. But I would say that in general, or at least when I was preparing for today and doing a little bit of research, that I could not come up with an example of a school in America, or many of the ones that I'm mostly familiar with in Europe, that holds a position with that title. We have professors of architecture technology, we have professors of building technologies, and of course we have the big umbrella of professors of architecture that might capture anything from design to structures, history, urbanism, and so on. So to me, the Professor of Architecture and Construction figure speaks of architectural traditions that recognize, value, and have a commitment to advancing knowledge that relates to making really good buildings. Disciplinary discourse and technique also capture some of the dimensions of what makes buildings really good through the framework of tectonics, for example, and tectonic discourse, but somehow both practice and education have tended to atomize architectural knowledge. So when thinking about Jeannette's work, integration, holistic design, and synthesis are some of the terms that come to mind. Her projects sit comfortably in the contexts where they are placed, but they're also new and different. Material choices include familiar collections, but they come together in innovative ways. Their projects support work and living and learning, and buildings have done that for centuries, but with the care that comes from understanding how contemporary cultures of life are evolving and in which ways space making can and should support them. The work is elegant and understated, concerned with the stuff of matter, but light at the same time, of a global character, but decidedly cited and of their context, both timeless and innovative. Thank you, Jeannette, for making the trek all the way to LA. It's a pleasure to welcome you to AUD.
Thank you, Mariana. That was such a generous introduction. And actually, there's a little anecdote before I even get started, is that the last lecture that I gave before lockdown was in LA. And in fact, it was right here. Since then, a lot has happened. I feel like I'm in some sort of time warp thing. And of course, we've had to contemplate on a lot of things that we do and the impacts of what we do out in the world. And so a little bit of that lecture, I think the beginning of the lecture will touch upon some of the things that's kind of preoccupied us, I guess, since then, especially because in that time, I shifted over from the GFC to teaching in TU Munich, which is a very heavily technical school. So if you think it was already very, rational and nerdy what we did, now it's kind of even more towards that end of the spectrum. So it will be a very nerdy lecture, let's just say. But hopefully that will provoke some thoughts and discussions later on. So architecture is a very slow process when we compare it to other sort of media-based sort of disciplines. And that slowness is compounded by a certain permanence, because whatever we do, whatever we build, doesn't just come down right away, right? And even if it does, it's already had an impact. And yet, while our works have a certain permanence, everything that happens in it is ephemeral. Even habits and traditions change over time. Daily, seasonal, or generational rhythms. Traditionally, the responsibility of the architect has been mainly towards the client. You could say that, we would be given a brief, we would fulfill that brief, and the project would be a building that's kind of an object that you hand over. And after the hand over the keys, that's it, you're out of the picture, right? But we realize more and more that our work and our responsibility as architects is in fact far greater than that. We're entrusted not only with resources that we can understand as common goods, but in fact, we collectively shape the built environment, and with materials, with resources that begin their lives before it even arrives at our job site, far earlier, than in fact before we enter the picture, and whose effects are longer lasting than any one of us in this room. So in the past, not designing with that idea in mind has, of course, led to a lot of waste, a lot of buildings that would be demolished, an inefficient use of resources, ways of thinking about, typology, let's say, or program that leads to obsolescence. So, that led us to also confront a lot of things in the last few years of what that would mean. The construction industry is one of the largest generators of waste globally. It's projected by 2025, we will be generating 2.2 billion tons of global waste. And of course, this is from things like, production offcuts, practices on the construction site, as well as, deconstruction, demolition, things that, happens when a building is deemed obsolete. But we can't rethink the future of construction without tackling what this means, not only in terms of how to reduce waste, but also how to be more resourceful and durable in the way that we build. Of course, reusing existing buildings is an important topic. I think that, adaptive reuse, let's say, is one of the biggest things that will be within our purview in the next years. But we also have to be better about what we build new and what we consider sustainable. Our measurements of sustainability, for example, have been, until very recently, mainly focused on energy efficiency or technical add-ons. So you think about PV cells or green roofs or things that basically don't really affect the way that we think about the configurations or the conceptual, let's say, underpinnings of a building. In Switzerland, for example, the let's say LEED equivalent was Minergie, which was all about how do you keep energy in a building or as efficient as possible. And so these measurements, while justified at the time, really don't rethink the fundamentals of how we build and also how we design, and what our values are. And in fact, they might have even added to the missteps that we've taken. So the goals were not to improve, or not really. The goals were to improve, but not really to sort of change the system. But what if the system was wrong? what if, in fact, focusing on these standards of delivery, really was about, just reinforcing again this idea that architecture was a closed object or a finished object, but that in reality, where we have to sort of become involved in is thinking about the entire lifespan of a building and what that means, also after they hand over the keys. So, how do we build, for example, with a certain resiliency that maximizes these resources that we put into play? If we believe in this diagram, then in fact, the biggest opportunity for us as architects is to understand these relationships, to understand the moments of interface between the different systems that we bring together in a building and how we can be most effective in each case. It requires us to work intensively with others, in particular with structural engineers and climate engineers, at least that's my point of view, in the way that we work, to envision really the life of a building holistically. So we know, not everything lasts, but if structure, for example, is the element that will be there for the entire lifetime of a building because we need it to hold it up, then why shouldn't we use that to our advantage? If building services last only roughly 15 years, shouldn't we see if we can build without it? Sustainability today, of course, comes with a lot of baggage, especially if you went to school in Berkeley back in the days when I did. But it's a moving target because it's changing all the time. Just even within the last 5 years in Europe, it's completely changed what we talk about. What is good, what is right changes. So we're constantly revising the standards and approaches, and that change is good. But what it means is really difficult for us to translate. What does it mean pedagogically? Let's say what the types of skills we need to transmit or to teach to students. What does it mean in terms of architecture and construction? So the need for reuse, for disassembly, for repair, means that we need to be even more conscious of how things come together, of the seams, the joints, of parts to whole. And of course, how things come together also determines how things come apart. This is our language, our medium. But in this kind of time of overwhelming responsibility, perhaps we shouldn't lose sight of why we do what we do. Design for us is inseparable from the technical solutions, but it's also more than the technical solutions. A truly vibrant or inspiring space, it's not something that we design by problem solving, but one that we design by intuitions and visionary convictions that translate into a kind of added value. So we can say that we're in a time when there is no certainty of knowledge, and that we need to stay flexible and open in our ways of thinking. So what does that mean? How can we prepare our students for questions that we ourselves may not yet know, or for situations that are beyond our current comprehension? We're caught as architects more and more in this kind of storm of competing demands. We used to, of course, also be in that position before, from clients, from consultants, from codes, regulations, and now, of course, there's all of this other stuff with climate crisis, sustainability, all the kind of social, let's say, responsibilities that we have. So how can we, in this seeming chaos, find a vision that still holds it all together? Maybe we should reconsider the relationship of the figure in the field, of the incompatible elements that demand a logic and a way of thinking that's inclusive, a way of thinking that isn't about a perfect resolution at every moment, but about appreciating that tension that loosely holds together this difficult whole. But maybe above all, we need to understand that everything is connected. 200 years ago, Alexander von Humboldt had introduced us to this continuum of life. And there's a lot of problematic parts of his history as well, but I think there's also some really kind of revolutionary thoughts that he brought to the table already back then. Some biologists and geographers might have paid attention, but his writings were largely, let's say, ignored by the kind of design field or the built environment up until maybe quite recently. But we now know that this kind of philosophy is actually what really embodies a lot of what we do. So what happens, for example, on the mountain peaks effects what happens in the lakes. That has a deeper resonance when we think about our material ecologies, that our cities, for example, are inseparable from our landscapes. And, perhaps it's time for us to think of construction as a management of our material ecology through spaces that inspire and support collective life. Much of the work that we do in our office is tied not only to structural materiality, but also to a kind of ambition regarding the longevity or the generosity of a project. And this generosity is important when we think about the durability of a building, the ability of a project to anticipate change, or to be robust enough to be, let's say, appropriated, or to accommodate different conditions at the same time. But it's also a certain way of working with an economy of means, of really pushing the potentials of the space beyond this kind of initial response to the brief, but really to consider its broader social, economic, and ecological impacts. So in a way, rather than considering it as an object, we prefer to consider it as an infrastructure that we provide to the users. One such infrastructure that we recently completed is the Archaeological Center in Basel. And, when I was talking about time, this one took a really long time. We won the project in 2014, and we just finished the second phase of it, or just finished the entire thing last year. So it took about 8 years or so to complete. And the competition brief had 4 main challenges. First, we had to design a building that would sit on top of ruins. So, it might need to be deconstructed or disassembled in the future if they decide to sort of excavate on our site. We had to design a building that could be built in phases because they had no money. So if in case they don't get the kind of funding from the government, they would have to stop after the first phase and the project would have to look complete. Third, we had to design a building that could respond to a collection of architectural artifacts, archaeological artifacts that would constantly grow. So when we won the competition in 2014, they had 1.2 million artifacts. By the time we finished, it got to 2 million artifacts. And so the building had to have the capacity to absorb that change, but also potentially to expand with time. And lastly, we had to bring into the same building every type of workspace you could imagine. That goes from restoration labs, wood and metal workshops where they build like exhibitions and things like that, meeting rooms, library, archives, the workspaces for the archaeologists. They even have draftsmen for their kind of architectural drawings and things like that. So all of that had to be, of course, brought under one roof. And of course, everything had to be cheap. So the only thing that the archaeologists were not afraid of was time, because what's another 5 years when you've been in this dig for like 500 years? So we were interested in a system. When we started the project, we were really interested in exploring a kind of spatial structure, something that was abstract enough that could absorb all of these differences, all these programmatic differences, but also be able to kind of grow and contract and always look complete. At the same time, it would be, a strong spatial experience. This was the first time that the institute, basically this kind of archaeological institute, had a building to themselves. Previously, they were scattered over 14 different locations. And so, all of these people, that included, for example, not just the archaeologists, but also even down to the gardeners that were working out in the fields and things like that, the conservationists, everybody is now finally under one roof. And they've never had to be neighbors before. So that was another challenge, was how to kind of create this kind of informal exchange and transparency to build a kind of institutional identity. And to think about, for the director of this institute, what that would mean. So, and at the same time, we knew that this building would need to change, that it may not even last that long. And that led, of course, to a very direct language of construction, where there's a clear hierarchy between primary, secondary, and tertiary systems. So structural systems, mechanical systems, things like that. You can see, the structure everywhere. You can access everything, building systems, and easily sort of disassemble, repair, replace at any time. But having all the system exposed, of course, meant that we had to be even more careful in our collaborations with the consultants. All the sprinkler pipes, lighting, smoke detector sensors, all this kind of confetti that you normally don't want to think about, or you try to sort of, deal with at the end. This all, of course, had to be cleanly coordinated, and probably took us the majority of the time that we were working on the project to come up with a kind of overall logic for it that would make sense for the space, so it doesn't become a clutter. And of course, how these different layers would intersect, how these different layers would essentially, let's say, interrupt the structure or go through the structure while supporting a kind of overall reading of the space. The irony, of course, is that if everything went well, if all the coordination of the structures, the building systems and things like that are done well, nobody notices. Nobody sees all the hours and time that you've spent on the drawing boards with all the different engineers and things like that. All the negotiations, the trials and errors, because it sort of just speaks for itself. So this was the first steel building that we did. Switzerland is not a big place for steel construction. It does a lot of other types of construction, but steel is relatively, let's say, minimal used there. We're doing another building now in Houston that I will show at the end. But the fascinating thing, of course, with steel construction is the prefabrication. And so when you have a modular system, then it goes super fast, right? So this was all erected sort of on site. And of course, it meant that through all of that, the details had to be thought through ahead of time. But it also allowed us to have little bits of fun like this, where we would really introduce also moments that maybe are more sort of hands-on, graspable to the user. In the end, however much we want to sort of obsess about the construction, the only thing that really matters, is the space that's being experienced. So we are interested in this kind of juxtaposition, in the sense that, maybe you can even say this contradiction between a very rational system, also for us as architects, sort of coming up with something which is a conceptual sort of driving force behind it, but that in the end, it's really the experience itself that speaks. So this kind of spatial dynamism, which is something that's very visceral, something that people can just go into a space and enjoy without having to get an explanation for. The Biden Secondary School is a project in Rapperswil-Jona that's about an hour east of Zurich. And it's a really beautiful existing campus of sort of very low-lying pavilions, an elementary school, a kindergarten. We, when we did the competition, we decided to make the building as compact as possible by stacking 2 floors of classrooms on top of a large sports hall. And spanning the classrooms over the gym meant that the floor plate was deeper than usual. We took this really as a chance to rethink the typology of the school, to gain a space that actually wasn't defined or asked for in the brief. Instead of corridors leading to the classrooms, we introduced this kind of grand central hall on each level. It's a kind of study space that actually has over time been also used for many different types of events. They introduced this kind of class breakfast that they would have once a semester. It's also been used for exhibitions, for parents' nights. But it also changes, in terms of different cycles of time over the week and over a semester. Courtyards bring in daylight, but they are actually also the kind of vertical supports, basically, for the slab. The corner, let's say, columns, or the corner mullions, let's say, that seems to be mullions in this image, are actually columns for the structure. So it makes the actual floor itself seem column free. And spatially, they act like rooms, sort of inverting the relationship between inside and outside. They break down the scale of this kind of central hall so that you end up with a sequence of spaces that are more intimate, and that you can kind of, find niches in where you can, read or study. The timber structure is exposed throughout. It's painted, but the beams give a very strong sort of texture to the ceiling. They go, all the way, from this kind of central space through the classrooms to the outside, and sort of unify the entire experience. So when you walk through, the space, opens up in the center, but also allows for these kind of areas of retreat. And this area actually has been very popular with the students also, taking breaks between classes and studying here, doing group projects and things like that. So it functions really as an extension of the classroom. And what's of course fascinating with timber construction, it's similar, I guess, to steel in that sense, is that you have to already think in quite precise details from the very beginning. So these were drawings that our timber engineer brought to us at pretty much our very first meeting in schematic design. So right after we won the competition. And they're beautiful drawings, really done pristinely, beautiful with these colors and things like that. But at the same time, it was so scary when we first sat down with them to have this right at the beginning, because we're not used to working in such detail already from the get-go. But in the end, what's interesting was that the final details are not even that far away from what this was. At the same time, similar again to steel, the prefabrication allowed us to save a significant amount of time on the construction side. So the lower two levels, the kind of ground floor and the basement where the sports hall is, was in concrete. I think that was all taking about 3.5 months or so to construct. And then the upper two levels took about 3 weeks to assemble. And timber is, of course, one of the few constructive systems where thermal bridging isn't an issue. So that's where we can really be quite expressive also with the structure, given, coming to the outside. Of course, you guys don't have that thermal bridging issue as much in LA as we do in Switzerland. But this basically allowed us to have these this kind of expressiveness of these balconies with this timber structure, that allowed us also to make the building look lighter and smaller, maybe a little bit more pavilion-like, you could say, that would fit it into the context. But they are also a bit of a code trick in the sense that these are fire escapes. So the balconies allow the classrooms to kind of exit immediately to the outside, which is what allowed us also then to use that central hall with loose furniture. So this next project that I'm showing is a lab building that is funded by the city of Basel for chemistry and pharmaceutical startups. It's kind of an interesting typology because I don't think it really existed so much before this. We know, of course, of speculative office buildings where you don't build for a client, where you build, to rent out spaces, but it typically doesn't happen for chemistry labs. Usually, especially in Basel, which is a big sort of pharmaceutical hub, you have these pharmaceutical giants that they build for their own company, and so they're very much tied to one identity, one company. In this case, this was the city basically teaming up with some private developers to really think about a new typology of promoting kind of research and exploration in the kind of pharmaceutical fields. And so the program had a kind of central contradiction. The spaces had to be very flexible because maybe in 5 or 10 years' time, you would have different tenants in there. But at the same time, it's a lab building. So it has all these heavy technical demands, things that basically are in line with, say, a hospital where you have all sorts of mechanical systems and things like that have to be sort of run in there. So in a way, it was a big challenge to think about, how could you be very, very specific for the activities of these types of companies, but at the same time be flexible enough to absorb any number and scale of them. The site itself is actually quite central in Basel. It's in currently a kind of a closed off campus of pharmaceutical sort of buildings and things like that. But the city wanted also to open this up, to integrate it into the city. So this was a master plan that was done by Herzog and de Meuron that included 6 pencil towers. And our building is the first kind of building block within that, which is the very small nubby building that's on the lower right corner. And so that would start the kind of opening up of this whole campus. And so the building itself also included some programs that would really be things that the general public could also access, which is also different from typical sort of pharmaceutical research labs and things like that. So the first couple of levels really are meant to also tie it back into the city. And to address this kind of question of flexibility, we started looking at the program and really sort of separated out into different types, or as Georges Perec would call them, sort of species of spaces. By separating, for example, the labs from the offices and from the collective areas, we could really be much more specific and targeted in the way that we thought about each one of those, architecturally, but also spatially. So out of that logic, we were not only able to sort of celebrate the qualities of each type of space, but also create, sort of logics in and of themselves. So logics that maybe were almost like buildings within a building that maximizes the functionality. So instead of a kind of one size fits all, we technically just designed like a lab building within an office building that sits on top of a public building. So this would allow us to sort of focus also on the areas that are most intensive in terms of the services, in terms of the building systems and things like that, and to really design sort of multiple means of access for the infrastructure in the labs. Lab buildings are usually very difficult typologies to do with natural ventilation, but by condensing the labs, it sort of frees us up to think about other areas a little bit more freely. And structurally, that was also a bit of a challenge. We actually wanted to also think about what we could do with different types of materials that maybe would go away from concrete, but we could not do without concrete in this case because of the very, very sensitive instruments that they would have. They have these hypersensitive lab instruments that basically could not take any type of vibrations, which meant that a fully timber building or even a steel building would not satisfy that. But we worked very closely with our structural engineers, Jeannette Kuo, and came up with a strategy to minimize the use of concrete and essentially designed kind of concrete frame system, almost like a horizontal Verandale, that would be rigid in and of itself, but that would allow us also to insert sort of timber slab infills. And the thing that we kind of forget in a way is that the most concrete that's used in a building is usually not in the vertical structure, but really in the horizontal, in the slab. So if we can save it there, we already have a huge advantage. In this case, I think we saved almost 40% of concrete use. And it also allowed us to kind of address this issue of flexibility, because basically all of these kind of timber infills would be very easily unplugged if a tenant would like to kind of rent 2 floors and connect in between. So that was kind of also one of the things that for us was important about this. The kind of hybrid timber concrete construction is played out through the different parts of the building. Here you see this main atrium space with the main stair, where the concrete allows really for this kind of generous sort of large atrium that connects between different levels. This beam, which is a ring that kind of provides a stiffening for this void. And then on the lower levels, there's a mezzanine that we inserted, which is fully timber. It's currently planned as meeting rooms and seminar rooms on this level for the University of Basel, who's going to be one of the first tenants. But that can be removed in the future if the users change. And this hybrid, system in a way takes advantage of the qualities of each of the materials to make a kind of better whole. The house on a slope is actually a housing project for 5 apartment units that's in a neighborhood just outside of Zurich. It's kind of a suburb of Zurich that is quite posh. It's kind of in this area that's called the Gold Coast with, kind of hillside views to the lake. And, borrowing a phrase from Barbara Bester, it's a project of stealth density. So this is an apartment building disguised to look like a single family home because we have also the same NIMBY issues that you guys have here in LA. And, so instead of the typical sort of lot of single family house, we try to squeeze as much as possible within this similar single lot. And the client came to us with a kind of interesting request because he himself actually wanted to kind of develop a kind of diversity of units that were to attract kind of smaller scale or smaller or wanted a combination of diverse sort of units at a smaller scale to attract basically people that have been priced out of Zurich. So, mixed income renters that are maybe young families or, people sort of working in the neighborhood and things like that. And in a way, we started looking really at how we could sort of maximize the buildable volume on this site, which is what regulates, in terms of building codes in this part of town. And most of the time, basically in this area, what defines the maximum buildable envelope is really the offset of the existing slope. So you take the terrain and then you say, okay, there's this height, and then essentially that defines the maximum height that you can build and then the maximum envelope. And you see most of the time that, especially in this area where it's really this kind of view to the lake, is that they do it by an approximation of that line through a terracing. So you have a lot of terraced housing, which preferences, let's say, the view, but basically does a same repetition for the units that's inside. So we chose instead to just kind of dumbly follow that code line of the slope and to essentially sort of offset that existing terrain and to think about that that volume really as a kind of a sloping volume. And of course, having a gable roof also means that you can have extra volume because they have different regulations about sloped roofs and flat roofs. So this allowed us also to integrate the building into this kind of villa context with this kind of gable roof expression, but at the same time to produce really a series of radically different apartments that are different price segments, each of which have their own kind of spatial characteristic. So you would have, for example, a split level garden unit, handicap accessible apartments on the ground floor, or pitched roof apartments on the upper levels. And one of them is also a kind of a duplex unit over 2 floors. And you would see in these diagrammatic plans, the kind of gray hatched areas sort of define let's say the characteristics of each of the apartments with their common areas. So the garden units, for example, have a kind of split level that kind of opens to the garden. There's one that has this kind of diagonal series of spaces that connects to the 2 sides with 2 different exposures. And then there's another unit where it's kind of stretching along the entire length of the building from the street to the garden. And each apartment has at least 2 exposures and a kind of its own outdoor space. And at the same time, they're all really densely packed into this kind of larger hole, revolving around one relatively compact circulation core. So the landscape is intentionally left kind of low maintenance. So we had this kind of slope that we just allowed to run naturally with just two sort of geometrical interventions, two circles. One which is above, really to negotiate the slope from the street to the main entrance, so that could be a handicap accessible entrance. And then another, which is this kind of large circle in the garden below that becomes this common gathering space for barbecues or for the children to play. And so this was one of the last study models that we did before we went into construction. It's really to sort of study the facades. We do a lot of big models in our office to kind of test out a whole number of things. But here in this case, it was also just to convince the client, of course, that the concrete and the pigmentation of the concrete was the way to go. Here's the building when it was done. So we, of course, chose this kind of archetypal house form quite consciously along the street to really, break away again from the stigma of the apartment block. You see that it really blends into the neighborhood. The houses along the street are all single-family houses, including that peachy one in the background. The project is often mistaken, let's say, for a single family house as well, until you get maybe a bit closer and you start to realize that maybe there's something a little unusual about it, that it kind of starts falling away with the landscape. From downhill, you look up and you see this kind of very, very thin roof that's kind of this weightless, sharp plane that really gives the building a certain identity, but also of course, helps to shade a little bit this kind of upper balcony that's there. You also, see, of course, that the window types and the composition are purposely somewhat random, you could say. They're there to also obscure the kind of individual units that are inside, so you don't really know from the outside where one unit starts and the other one ends. But you really see this almost as a giant house. And then going inside to this kind of common stairwell that leads to all the apartments, it's all very simple, very straightforward, sort of raw materials. We have exposed concrete, these galvanized steel railings and exposed sort of light bulbs and things like that. Just with a bit of paint maybe and some curved elements that spiff it up a little bit to give it some playfulness. And I'll walk you guys through a few of these units just to give you a sense of what we meant by the different sort of spatial characteristics. This is the garden unit with this kind of split level with open kitchen and living area opening towards a common backyard. And you see down into this kind of living room where you feel like you're really kind of sinking into the ground and surrounded by nature. And then from the adjacent room, which could be used as a bedroom or a study, you can look back out in multiple directions, see that living room that's below as well. Here we're in the ground floor unit. This is an accessible unit with this kind of diagonal living space and pretty high ceilings. And here, you're just entering, you're in the kind of central hall and are looking from there towards this kind of living room space. And then the hall also then connects you to the kitchen, which is on the other end of that diagonal, where there's also a picture window to the outside. And then now from the kitchen, you can, towards the kitchen again, you can look back, again, towards the different types of spaces. You see this kind of sequence of it, that they're all kind of connected. And in a way, this central hall, it's as a typology, is something that's kind of died off a long time ago in Europe, and now it's making a comeback again. It's probably something that's more sort of early 19th century, where you come in, it's where you deposit your hat or your shoes and things like that. But it's really also an undefined space. It's a space that every user could appropriate in their own way, and sort of define it for themselves. So it could be a dining room or a playroom, or also just someplace where you put your shoes. And one more level up, there's 2 more apartments under this roof. One of these is the one that stretches this entire length of the building, that terraces down with the landscape. And here you're just entering. And now from this kind of lower moment of the unit, looking back up all the way to the very end towards the street. And one of the things that we were interested in when we were developing these units was also trying to look for characteristics that take you away from the typical idea of an apartment, and really to think about, well, what does it mean to live in a house? Why would you want to value living in a house that's different than living in an apartment? And so this idea of being able to travel inside of your apartment, or being able to kind of have a very different relationship to the outdoors, so that for us was important. But I just realized I missed one slide. But anyways, but in this apartment also, one thing that we did was we built in a hidden room. So it's a room that Mariana has traumas of hidden rooms. But anyways, it's a room that we felt like, as in an apartment, you don't have. Normally, you come into an apartment, you see everything. But in this one, it's all the way at the very end. There's a kind of pocket door that slides from the kitchen, and that you can have your own sphere that guests wouldn't know about, and that you can kind of escape to. And this 4th apartment is maybe the most heroic one. We were kind of jokingly calling it the bachelor pad, and sure enough, it got rented by a bachelor, or so we've been told. Somebody that works for Google or something like that, I don't know. And it's a pretty lofty type of space with an open plan, open kitchen and dining that steps into kind of living room, and then onto the balcony where you can see all the way to the center of Zurich. And here, of course, the roof isn't just about protecting this balcony, but it's also really to sort of frame that view, also to give it a certain sort of identity when you're sitting there. And this is, also part of the unit, as again, this kind of bedroom in the back, also kind of hidden room, that we felt was important to kind of have give a space of retreat or intimacy. And so all of these apartments were kind of jigsaw puzzled into this volume that normally would be for one family. So previously, I think there were 4 people, one family living there. Now it's 17 people. And this is the view from the neighbors, who were very concerned, actually, when we were designing this. In fact, we had to cut back that cantilever of the roof by 1 meter as part of the negotiation, because they were afraid that it would cast shadows onto their building or something like that, but or obstruct their views of the lake. But in any case, this was something that also, this kind of black concrete, which also the neighbors were very concerned about, really now here recedes into the background, and you see just the kind of sharpness of the windows and the roof that also, depending on the weather, just blends in with the sky. So here you see it in the context, again, like with the exception of the building that's just downhill of that one, everything else that's left and right are all single family homes. So I don't know, do I still have time? Okay, sorry, I tend to ramble on a little bit, but this is the last project. This is the project that we're just finishing up right now. It's about, I would say, if it goes according to the new schedule that they just informed us about, is that it should be finished in about a month or so. We're still, waiting anxiously to see if that's true. But this is an extension to the Rice School of Architecture in Houston. It's our first American project, or under our own names. And actually, it's a very exciting one, because it's one that didn't have a program really to begin with. We went through an RFP process, but it was really to find, they wanted to find a partner that they can work with to do the programming and to think about this whole thing with them. And that's, of course, a luxury and also a privilege to be able to do that, because you're thinking at the same time, not about a building, but about what it means to think about architecture, to teach architecture, and to do that in a way where we're thinking about that, with a certain duration in mind. So the idea of a building that also isn't about replicating what they already have, because they're a very small school. They don't want to grow because that's their identity. They didn't want more studios. And so it was really having this conversation with them about, well, what is it that would be important for the school? And for them, it was really about a kind of let's say supplementing things that they were not able to do until now. So working with big machinery, doing things that are more experimental, that are really going into the construction, fabrication, one-to-one prototyping, things like that. But also about research that they could do in groups, collaborations that they could have, and also exhibiting that work. So it was important also that in this space there was a gallery that they could use for the school to kind of greet the public. And so for us, it was actually an exciting thing to kind of think about. Exciting also because this was a project. I mean, the architecture school started with the Rice University campus back when it was founded. Already, one of the kind of first buildings that was defining the main quad. And so it occupies a kind of prime position. And it was extended by James Stirling in the late 80s, early 90s, with this space that kind of, was more public. But when you see this kind of Noli plan of the campus, you realize that, most of the buildings, especially in this part of campus, were all sort of double-loaded corridors, small cellular spaces, with the exception of that kind of James Stirling addition that really kind of blows out the center of Anderson Hall. Everything else was really, fitting that kind of typology of the double-loaded corridor. And of course, the big challenge that we had was that we had the school that wanted to have, programs that were really big and generous and industrial in nature, you could say, because of the scale of things that they wanted to do. But you had the board and committees and president of the university that basically wanted this whole thing to be very historical and very context specific and very much adhering to the small scale that they have there. So that was our central challenge, was how to make something really big, really small. And so one of the things that we started looking at was, and of course they wanted also that there would be a physical connection to the existing building. That was extremely important for them. So given the site that we had, which was this open swampy field next to the kind of courtyard, we actually found a moment to sort of dock into Anderson Hall on just above an existing arcade that would connect between Anderson Hall and the main university library. And so we connected with this kind of bar with a sloped roof. That was the first gesture that then we repeated into a series that became then a system. And that system both allowed us to kind of hide into the strategy an industrial typology, let's say, with this industrial shed roof, but at the same time to break it down in scale so that you kind of see the shifting of the bars as essentially the kind of narrow double-loaded corridor typologies that were there, seemingly from the outside. You see it here from the opposite side of the street. It's a very abstract system in a way, and also from the west side of the campus, where you would be approaching. Of course, we held back in deference to the Stirling sort of iconic west wall, with the kind of oculus window, and created together with it a kind of dialogue, right? Really, coming together with the Stirling to define this courtyard that the school uses really already for a lot of events. So for barbecues or their graduation ceremonies and things like that. And so that courtyard now really becomes the heart of the school itself. Organizationally, so the project is over 2 floors. There's no basement because of the flooding. We're not allowed to go underground. So everything is within these 2 floors, including all the mechanical systems and things like that. The upper level, of course, started with this connection to Anderson. So there's a kind of striation that organizes it. I'll get back to that again in a second. But that upper level, combined with the lower level, which is the fabrication hall, has then these double height moments that really visually connect them. So there is an idea about awareness of all the different activities that happen in the school. so that when you're coming in, I was just walking down the hallway earlier here as well, and I really love those double height moments that you can kind of look down at the reviews taking place, and kind of just be a spectator without being actively involved. So this was kind of, I would say that intention as well. And so we were looking at this system because they wanted to be able to have spaces that were defined but still connected, spaces that you could fluidly move from one layer to another, one user type to another, but that they would still all essentially have their own sort of private moments, maybe also areas where we can kind of close off for meeting rooms and things like that, and use also for maybe reviews and pinups. And so this is the level 2 plan. So the ends of those bars really become kind of more privatized moments, whereas other areas become more workspaces. It connects back into Anderson Hall, using a ramp that swings around the existing James Sterling skylight, that connects it back into this public moment, let's say, of the existing school. Because we were working with this arcade that defined the width, let's say, of that bar or each bar in the system, we wanted also to, of course, test to see that it was flexible for all the activities that they could imagine. These are, again, these large models that we were building to explore the space and the relationship, let's say, to the structure and the expression. These are some of the research areas in that building. Here again, looking also down towards the voids. Here you see it coming across, let's say, this bridge connector from Anderson Hall into the new space, where you see the layering of these different bars. And then on the ground floor, we would have then this large fabrication hall, as well as a gallery space that goes up to 2 levels. And so this was a view of that in model form, where you see this, and it has changed actually since this model was built, where on the left side, you would actually have a kind of curtain wall that opens towards the courtyard. And then, that for us was the kind of defining experience, let's say, of the building, is really being able to have all sorts of activities of different scales that take place simultaneously, but that you would always be aware of things that were happening, even if you were not actively participating in it. And so even this kind of, hall that's down below could be potentially cleared out for large scale types of events, maybe once a semester and things like that. And that you would have quieter activities that were happening above, where you can look down and be inspired. And then, again, this dialogue between the old and the new, that was something that was very important, of course, especially towards the non-architectural members, let's say, of the committees that we had to present to. And of course, materials was a big question, because they all wanted us to do the brick that was already on campus. And it took a long time and many rounds of vetoes before we ended up with the glazed terracotta that we have right now, which actually ended up, being something that we really loved and we're exploring at different levels, partly because it also has the same, let's say, production qualities as brick. You fire it, you get clay and fire it the same way that you would do brick in a way, but it has, of course, other aspects of it that are the fact that it's sustainable. It can be returned to the earth. It could also be self-cleaning, because it when the rain comes down, it just washes the dirt away. But also, of course, allows it to sort of fit together in the context as well. So that dialogue between old and new again. But yeah, so maybe I'm just gonna close off with this project, and leave you with these thoughts about time. Thank you. Yes, of course.
It's like too general a question, but you mentioned at the beginning about how you are kind of constantly adjusting for, like changing strategies in terms of sustainability and how that, like 5 years ago, like say the last time that you were lecturing here, that you might be talking about completely different things. And I was just wondering, when you're designing for architecture that's meant to outlast that like shift of pace and like how you strategize about those topics, how do you kind of, I guess, plan ahead for how you might address those shifts retroactively in a sense? Like how do you try to anticipate what the shifts might come?
I think that's a very good question. For us, it was in some ways about boiling down to what is most essential about architecture. So it used to be where, I don't say we and just us, but like the grand we, were very interested in how things look, right? There was a time, when I went to school, when I graduated in the early 2000s, that was a big thing of how things would look. And I had star architects with iconic buildings and things like that. And we weren't really thinking about what happens after that look fades or that look becomes passé, And so we're not so interested so much. Of course we're interested in how things look, but we're not interested in that look being the thing that defines it. I think we're interested in how it performs. And it led us to thinking about, what is essential about architecture, which is things that you cannot do without, right? And of course that also changes, but what doesn't change is you have to have structure. You can't, without structure, the building can't stand. So why do we, that's at least our point of view, is like we try not to clad things because that's extra resources, but we try to make use of what we need to do and use those things to define space. And then we think about, all the other things that have to also take place for that building to be used, and to use those elements to define, to become the kind of conceptual driving force, and it was very different because I went through education in a time when we took sources of inspiration from other fields, right? Where it was so far away maybe from architecture that you had to find another way to translate it back into architecture. And now, and especially now, because of all this kind of climate crisis and sustainable things that are important to us, we found ourselves, and this is, I would say, maybe by and large also Central European as an attitude, is that we found ourselves in a place where we cannot escape construction. We have to start from there because that's where everything starts. And that's why it's in that sense, I think that the things that are essential about defining a built project. Yeah, sorry.
Thanks so much. The work is really stunning and really varied from the first project you showed to the last and through that house. So kind of thing we're really thinking about a lot here in Los Angeles. I wonder if you could talk about time in relationship to, say, the last building. The first building, it was really obvious how you were thinking about it with cross-laminated timber and concrete, and the kind of interchangeability of panels that might be possible. In the last project, it seemed like it was the time of the historic campus and having to tie back into that more context than interior. I don't know if that reflects the changing thought of yours or if you
I think, yeah, well, I think that the last project, of course, had a very, very different type of context. In the first one, it was big open field, more or less, except that we, had ruins underneath. But in the last one, we had a very physical context that we were tasked to deal with. And that, of course, drove a lot of that approach. But it's also, I think there were affiliations, you could say, between the two projects, not just because they were both in steel, but because they were both an exploration on systems. So the last project was also about what are different spatial systems. So you had a spatial system, which is about a particular grain that's above, smaller scale, and another grain, which is below, and that those two grains overlap to produce a spatial experience, which is particular to that building. And so for us, it wasn't so much about program in the end. The program changes, and then they can rethink. I mean, similar to the first project. Also, we started off without any partitions in that upper level. Now there are partitions in there because they wanted to have, different types of meeting rooms and things like that. But that's also something that we knew, they could change themselves over time. They could add in more partitions or take them away, and so that was the idea, was that there would be a kind of infrastructure, infrastructural system that allows them to adapt.
I'm a third year here, and we are working on a housing studio, and it deals a lot with systems. And you spoke a lot about systems, whether it's structured or spatial, like ways of kind of dealing with the program, I guess. And I was wondering, like, it's very interesting how you kind of develop the systems and then find ways of playfulness, whether they were kind of the rooms. I mean, it's very interesting spaces, or like the last project. And I was wondering, how did you kind of find a way to kind of develop the system, but at the same time find playfulness that can happen within that system? We're not so much doing offices or like buildings that are kind of open or change programs, mainly like housing, which is a lot of repetition.
Yes.
So yeah, any comments, suggestions would be great.
So I wish I had a one sentence answer for you, but no, it's not so easy. But actually what's great is, so we work a lot in models. I know you guys work a lot in models, like physical models. We do also digital models. It's not that we don't, but we don't usually do digital models right at the very beginning, because we like to actually hold it in our hands and be able to sort of look inside of it. And so a lot of our models, they range in sizes from the very beginning, especially when we do housing, for example. The thing with housing is that you have to go from big to small, change in scale, no? Like you have to have the system, but the repetition, the thing. And so you have to go from thinking about spaces to thinking about like, how did this all repeat itself? And so we build a lot of models at different scales for that in parallel. So you're always looking at, the modules, how the modules overlap, what that means, what you create, but also then when it replicates itself, what it comes together as overall. I don't know if you guys work in groups here. I find housing to be a really interesting thing to be doing in groups, because you can do both ends and in parallel, and essentially explore and challenge each other basically with that conversation. So that's what we do a lot in our office.
Thank you for a wonderful lecture. The Swiss context versus the American context, very different relationship with means and methods. Could you maybe comment on that, especially with race wrapping up?
Sorry, kind of works. So I'll start from the construction end, because that's, of course, my preoccupation, not just with the position that I'm holding now in Munich, but also specifically because of where the Rice project is at and what it means to us. I find it curiously challenging and liberating at the same time, building in the US. Now, challenging because it's forcing us to deal with things in a very different way. We in Switzerland are always, what do you call that in the US now? So we don't build with a general contractor. We build almost like design build, right? But you have somebody on board with you that helps you manage the site. So we don't do that ourselves, but we partner up with somebody. So you're always in control. You speak to the contractors very directly, and we do it in this. Now all my English terminologies are gone. What is it called when you kind of build fast track? What? Sorry. Yeah. So thank you. Leave it to the Swiss to tell me. We build it a lot in fast track, which is that you start already construction before you finish all the details, but you're totally fine with that because you know that you're always in direct contact with the contractors that are working on the site, that you know you can design it with them and change things at the last minute. Not so the case in the US. That general contractor bubble, that is a closed bubble. You're at their mercy of how much information they let through to you. And in that vein, you have to think in very robust terms. You have to think in terms of like, what can they do? How can you design in a way that they can do the least harm if they don't inform you of something? Then the thing that I think is liberating about that is because then you make a lot of broad decisions and strong decisions early on that protect you from that process. And also because if you have the right client that's behind you in the US, I think you can get a lot through. Yeah, I was just talking about, back to your question also. I was talking to Mariana about this earlier. We were chatting and catching up before, that's why we were a bit late. But we were talking about how, you know, the kind of technical demands in Switzerland, right? Or in Europe, where there's just so much code and regulation and things like that, that you have to prove your project through the technicalities. So you can't just design an idea and sell a client on that. You have to make sure it works. Like all the competitions that we submit, they're at SD level. You know, you have to do a 1 to 50 section, which is like a constructive section, to show how a facade is composed and all the details of that. You know, so that's the context we operate in.
I guess the last part is kind of like already into my question, but you show really beautiful like MEP diagrams. I assume it's your architectural office produced them, not directly from MEP consultants, right?
That's not entirely true. We work very close. We heavily redline, let's say, but the MEP consultants are actually very good in the US. I mean, so not in Switzerland, in working with you and producing good drawings. So also the engineers, I mean, those drawings from the engineers, they're really from the engineers, you know, like we did not redraw them in any way. But it's because everybody is sort of in lockstep and, you know, like everybody understands that they have to produce these types of drawings. But
yeah, that's very impressive. Also, you showed a lot of different structural typologies in your work. I'm curious, like at what stage, like in your very early stage or like in concept phase, you already start thinking the whole structural system and also this construction, you know, the logistics, or do the architects dominate the structural system, or can you expand on that a little bit on the details and also the structural and everything?
yeah. So I think that, you know, I mean, well, we are particularly really interested in structures. I mean, even, you know, way back when, I think that, you know, both Unal and I come from, you know, I think obsessions about structure before we even met and started our office. And I think that the thing with the work of it, though, it's not that it's not the first thing we think about, but it's very early. I don't think it can be the first thing we think about, because then I think it's too reductive. You know, I think it's difficult to just start with technicals. Something else has to kind of push back onto it. But we engage with the engineers very early on. So, you know, in a competition, say, we might have a concept and we would run it up against the engineer before we kind of move forward with it, because we needed to know, well, is this plausible? Could this be done? And then we would design. We would actually, it's a lot of ping-ponging, right? Like it's a lot of, so we have a base knowledge of structures, let's say. But we enter into discussions with structural engineers probably in a very different way than at least say I've been taught previously. So the engineering part is not about solving what we have done, but really it's a conversation.
wasn't aware of the specific construction faculty position for this option. I'm just kind of curious if maybe you could speak to what a program might be missing without that kind of expertise in the classroom, maybe the things that you are in your.
You know, it's not a thing in the US, you know, as Mariana was saying. I think I went to Berkeley at a time when it was very tectonic. We had tectonic times there. And then I went to the GSD, which was probably considered also one of the more, let's say, constructive based places at the time. But none of them really taught me how to build. But I don't necessarily think that was bad. I mean, it's of course, you know, I can't say, it's difficult to say. I mean, I think that, you know, they taught me to think in a way that now I can kind of take that kind of conceptual analytical thinking and systematic thinking into a kind of constructive means. So I think that it's good to have both sides. I worry about scenarios when people don't have both sides, you know. So I came from a very theoretical basis into then a very constructive basis when I went and worked in Europe. I did, you know, a whole stint before I started grad school. And that sort of gave me the anchor. I know, you know, for example, Mariana had an amazing, you know, education plan in Buenos Aires or in Argentina that had a lot of constructive basis to it. And, you know, and then she came and brought all these kind of crazy ideas to the GSD as well, that were fantastic also from a conceptual point of view, but with that basis, right? And I think that kind of combination is really powerful. It's also powerful because it puts you in the position of control in the sense that knowing how to build is controlling the money. Knowing how to build is controlling the quality. Knowing how to build is controlling, you know, how things would be processed on your job site. If you don't know that language, that puts you always in the position of not, you know, like, so this is what I was expressing as about the frustration of operating in the American context when I'm in the blind, when I'm like telling the general contractors, please let me know what is this possible or not? Why are you not telling me this? You know, why are you kind of just holding me back? Because I'm not engaged in that conversation. I cannot drive it. And then things appear on the job site and I'm like, whoa, where did this come from? You know, and then you have to scramble to react to it. And then by that time, there's no budget and there's no way to do it, right? So knowledge is control.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.